I was signing the last of my patient's discharge paperwork when my phone buzzed on the counter. My uncle's attorney. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. I stepped into the break room and answered. He introduced himself as Conrad Fitch, said he'd been handling my Uncle Gerald's estate for the past decade, and that he was sorry to be calling under these circumstances. Gerald had passed 4 days ago, quietly, in the house he'd lived in for 40 years in Savannah. I hadn't known he was sick. He hadn't told anyone. I had to sit down for what came next. He left everything to me. The house on Abercorn Street, his investment portfolio, and the proceeds from the sale of his manufacturing company, which had closed escrow 2 weeks before he died. After taxes and fees, I was looking at just over $91 million. I said nothing for a long moment. Conrad waited. Uncle Gerald was my father's older brother, the one who never married, never had children, and spent 40 years building a business nobody in our family fully understood. He and I had a quiet relationship. Holiday calls, the occasional letter, one visit when I was in residency that neither of us talked about much afterward. He wasn't warm in the way people mean when they say that, but he was consistent. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered things. He sent a card every year on my medical school graduation anniversary, not my birthday. I never asked him why. I asked Conrad if he was certain. He said yes, 3 times, because I asked 3 times. My first thought wasn't about the money. It was about my older brother. Holt and I aren't close. We were close once, maybe, when we were small, but somewhere in our teens, the gap between us stopped being a gap and started being a wall. I went to college on scholarship, then medical school, then a fellowship in vascular surgery. Holt made different choices. Real estate ventures that never quite materialized, partnerships that dissolved, a knack for spending money he hadn't earned yet. Our parents spent years trying to balance us, always softening whatever I achieved so Holt wouldn't feel left behind. I understood the impulse. I didn't appreciate the result. If he found out about this before I had a chance to get my footing, it would become his project. That was just the truth of who he was. I told Conrad I needed a few days before we met in person. He said that was fine. I asked him to keep the terms private for now. He said he would, and I believed him. I finished my shift, which took another 4 hours and required me to focus completely, which was both a curse and a mercy. By the time I drove home to my apartment in Charlotte, it was past 10. I sat in my car in the parking deck for a while before going inside. $91 million. I opened my laptop and stared at my online banking dashboard, just to anchor myself in the reality of the number I'd been living with before the call, my savings account, my loan payoff schedule, my retirement contributions. Everything that had felt like solid ground 24 hours ago now looked like a rest stop on a much longer road. I closed the laptop and went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there thinking about the last time Holt had called me 8 months ago, asking if I could co-sign on a line of credit for a new project. I'd said no. He hadn't spoken to me since. I knew I needed to move carefully. The next morning, I called Conrad back and told him I'd drive down to Savannah that weekend. I also asked him one direct question. Was my name anywhere public yet? He said no. The estate was still in probate, and as a private trust, the terms wouldn't be filed in any public record. I had time, but not unlimited time. I packed a bag after my Friday shift and made the drive south. Savannah greeted me the way it always does. Thick air, slow streets, the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself. I checked into a small hotel near Forsyth Park instead of staying at Uncle Gerald's house. I wasn't ready for that yet. Conrad's office was on the 2nd floor of a restored building on Bull Street. He was older than his voice suggested, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on. We spent 2 hours going through the trust documents. It was airtight. My uncle had been thorough in a way that felt almost like a message. No conditions, no stipulations, no provisions for any other family members. Just my name repeated throughout in language that left no room for interpretation. I signed what needed to be signed. Conrad told me the funds would transfer within the week. On my way back to the hotel, I stopped in front of my uncle's house. It was a 3-story Greek revival on a quiet block, cream-colored with black shutters, a magnolia in the front yard that had probably been there longer than any of us. A neighbor was sweeping her porch across the street. She looked up and waved. I waved back and kept walking. I didn't go inside that day. I wasn't ready for what I'd feel. That night, I ordered room service and made 2 calls. The first was to my closest friend from residency, a woman named Farah, who now ran a cardiology practice in Atlanta and who knew how to keep her mouth shut. I told her the outline. She was quiet for a moment, then said simply, "Don't tell Holt yet." I said I wasn't planning to. She said good. Then she asked if I was okay. That was the first time anyone had asked me that since the call from Conrad, and I didn't have a clean answer. The second call was to my financial advisor, a careful man named Elliot who I'd worked with for 3 years. I gave him the number. He was also quiet for a moment. Then he asked when I wanted to start moving things. I told him to give me a week. I drove back to Charlotte on Sunday. Holt called Monday morning. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that said he was in town and wanted to grab lunch. Just checking in. The kind of message that sounds casual and isn't. I called him back an hour later and told him I was in the middle of a surgery block all week. He said okay, maybe next week, no edge in his voice that I could detect. I hung up and stood in the hospital corridor for a moment, wondering how long the quiet would last. It lasted 4 days. My mother called Thursday evening. She had that particular tone she gets when she's delivering someone else's agenda, warm but rehearsed, like she'd been coached on what to say and was mostly sticking to the script. She said Holt had heard something through a cousin who knew someone who worked near Conrad's office. She said the word inheritance, like she was testing whether I'd flinch. I didn't. I told her I'd spoken with Conrad about Uncle Gerald's estate and that everything was being handled properly. She asked if there was something she should know. I said, when there's something to share, I'll share it. She pushed gently. That's her style. Gentle pressure applied in the exact right places. And I told her I loved her and that I had an early morning. I hung up before she could redirect. 20 minutes later, Holt texted, "Call me when you get a chance." I didn't respond that night. He showed up at my apartment building the next evening. I was coming back from a run when I saw him standing by the entrance in a sport coat, hands in his pockets, doing that thing he does where he tries to look relaxed and doesn't quite manage it. I stopped a few feet away. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "You live 2 hours away." I had a meeting. I let him in because I wasn't going to have the conversation on the sidewalk. He sat on my couch and looked around the apartment the way he always does, cataloguing, assessing, running some calculation I was never fully meant to see. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He asked about work. I said busy. Then he said it. "So Gerald left you something?" "I'm handling the estate. How much are we talking?" I looked at him for a moment. "That's not how this works, Holt." He shifted forward. "He was family. He was our uncle. If he left you anything significant, it affects all of us." "It's in my name," I said. "Not all of us." His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. He said he wasn't trying to make it a fight. He said he just thought families were supposed to help each other. He said he'd been working on something, a development project in Charleston, a mixed-use property near the waterfront, and that it was the kind of thing that just needed the right early investor to make it real. He said he knew I was careful with money, that he respected that, but that this was different. I told him I wasn't going to invest in his project. He said he wasn't asking for a handout. I said I knew what he was asking for, and the answer was no. He left without saying goodbye. The door didn't slam, which almost made it worse. A slammed door is emotion. What he did was strategy. He left quietly so I'd spend the next hour wondering what he was planning. I spent the next hour wondering what he was planning. I called Farah and told her about the visit. She asked me if I'd changed my locks recently. I said the building had keycard access. She said that wasn't what she meant. I told her I'd be careful. The next 2 weeks were quiet in the way that precedes weather. I drove down to Savannah on a Saturday to walk through Uncle Gerald's house for the first time alone. The neighbor from across the street, an older woman named Mrs. Pace, came over when she saw my car. She'd known my uncle for over 20 years. She told me he talked about me sometimes, that he said I was the one who understood the value of doing something the hard way. I thanked her and stood there on the porch for a little while after she went back inside, thinking about a man I hadn't known quite as well as I should have. Inside, the house was exactly what I'd have expected from Gerald. Clean lines, nothing excessive, good furniture that had aged well. Books arranged by subject, not by aesthetic. A framed photograph on the study desk that I hadn't expected. The two of us, from my residency visit, standing in front of the hospital entrance. I was in scrubs. He had his coat on even though it had been 90 degrees outside. I didn't remember who took the picture. I sat in his study for a long time. When I got back to Charlotte, I started making changes. New account at a different bank, entirely separate from anything I'd shared with family over the years. Elliot began repositioning assets. Conrad had already transferred the first tranche of the inheritance into the trust account, and I'd signed the authorization for the rest. On the professional side, I also reached out to a woman named Dr. Bate, Renata Osei, a colleague from my fellowship who had spent the last 5 years building a surgical group in Savannah. We'd talked loosely about partnership before. Now I called to ask if that conversation was still on the table. She said it was. I didn't tell her about the inheritance directly, but I told her I had capital to invest if the structure was right. We agreed to meet in 3 weeks. The first sign that Holt was working an angle came from an unexpected direction. A colleague of mine, an attending in the cardiac unit, mentioned at lunch that someone had reached out to him about an investment opportunity in Charleston. Mixed-use waterfront, he said. The person who contacted him mentioned they were close to a prominent surgeon in Charlotte who was looking for partners. He'd assumed they meant me. They did. I kept my face neutral and asked who had reached out. He gave me a name I didn't recognize, but the project description was word for word what Holt had described in my apartment. My brother was using my professional network as a reference point without asking me. He was building credibility on a name he didn't have permission to use. I thanked my colleague and told him the project wasn't affiliated with me in any way and that he should be cautious. After lunch, I called Conrad. He started drawing up a formal letter. Not aggressive, just clear. My name was not to be used in connection with any investment solicitation. He sent it to the address I had on file for Holt. 2 days later, Holt called. His voice was careful. I don't appreciate being sent a cease and desist from your lawyer. I don't appreciate you using my name to attract investors without asking me. I didn't use your name. You referenced your connection to a prominent surgeon in Charlotte who was looking for partners. Who else would that be? Silence. Holt, I told you no. That was my answer. I need you to stop. He said I was being territorial. He said Uncle Gerald would have wanted the family to grow together. I told him that was a convenient reading of a man he'd seen maybe 6 times in the past decade. He said that wasn't fair. I said a lot of things weren't fair and ended the call. That evening I drove out of the city for a while, just to have the road under me. I pulled off at a rest area somewhere past Concord and sat in the dark with the engine off. The night was clear enough to see a few stars through the windshield. The situation was manageable, I knew that. I had good people around me. The legal structure was solid, and Holt didn't actually have access to anything I hadn't given him. But something about the way he'd shifted, from asking directly to working around me, made the back of my neck feel tight. He'd moved from the front door to the window. That meant I needed to be looking at the window. Thara flew in the following Friday. We hadn't seen each other in 4 months, and she arrived with 2 bottles of wine and 0 patience for small talk. We sat at my kitchen table and I walked her through everything: the inheritance, the visit from Holt, the investor solicitation, Conrad's letter. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she was genuinely worried. When I finished, she said, "Has he reached out to your parents?" He had. I found that out 2 days later when my mother called again. This time the rehearsed warmth was gone. She was upset. And when my mother is upset, she doesn't perform it. She goes quiet and precise. She said Holt had told her I was sitting on an enormous amount of money while he was struggling and that I'd sent him legal threats instead of talking to him like family. I told her the full version of events. She listened. She didn't say I was wrong, exactly, but she also said she didn't understand why I couldn't just talk to him. I told her I had talked to him. I told her the conversation had happened in my living room and then continued through my attorney because that was what he'd made necessary. She said, "You've always been the strong one. Sometimes that means giving a little." I told her I loved her and got off the phone. That night I started a document. Not emotional, not personal, a timeline. Every interaction with Holt since the inheritance, dated with specifics. Conrad had suggested it a week earlier. I'd been putting it off because documenting your own brother's behavior feels like a kind of defeat. But Farah was right when she said that if this escalated, I'd want the record. It escalated. A woman named Cressida Marsh reached out to me through my hospital's main line. She said she was a journalist writing about high net worth professionals in the Southeast, and that she'd heard I had an interesting story. She was friendly and professional, and the whole thing smelled wrong from the first sentence. I told her I wasn't available for comment and hung up. I called Conrad immediately. He said this was consistent with a pressure tactic. Someone trying to get a reaction on record before a legal move. He said Holt might be building toward a challenge, either contesting the estate or trying to establish some claim of undue influence. He asked if there was anything in my relationship with Uncle Gerald that could be framed that way. I said no. He said he believed me, but we needed to be ready anyway. We spent 2 hours that afternoon going through every piece of documentation related to the estate correspondence, the trust timeline, Gerald's own communications with Conrad over the years. It was thorough and a little surreal, building a case file about a dead man I genuinely cared about. What we found was actually reassuring. Gerald had updated the trust 3 times in the past 12 years, each time affirming my name. Each time with independent witnesses and a notarized record. The last update had been 14 months ago. Whatever Holt tried to claim about timing or influence, the paper trail said otherwise. I also found something else in the documents. A letter my uncle had written and never sent, folded into the back of the file Conrad handed me. It was addressed to me, 3 paragraphs, written in Gerald's careful, slightly formal handwriting. He said he'd watched me build my life without asking permission from anyone, that I'd never waited for the family to decide what I was allowed to be, and that he found that remarkable in a way he'd never quite figured out how to say directly. He said the money wasn't a reward. It was a continuation. He wanted what he'd built to go somewhere it would actually grow. I read it twice, put it back in the envelope, and held it for a moment. Then I got back to work. Over the following 3 weeks, I operated on 12 patients, finalized the partnership structure with Dr. OC, and made 3 trips to Savannah to oversee the opening of Uncle Gerald's house. I had the locks changed on the 2nd trip. On the 3rd, I met with a security consultant about a system for the property. The journalist never called again. Holt did. Once, a week after the Conrad warning letter had been followed by a second, more pointed notice. His voice was different this time, not strategic, not rehearsed. He sounded tired. He said, "I just need to understand why you won't help me." I told him I had helped him. I'd given him money twice before in the previous 4 years, without conditions, without expecting it back. I'd co-signed a loan when he was starting out. I'd referred him to 2 people in my professional network who might have been useful. None of it had stuck. He said that was different. I said, "What's different is that this time I have more, and you think that means I owe you more. That's not how it works." He didn't respond to that. I told him I wasn't going to fund his project, and I wasn't going to let him use my name to recruit people who trusted me, and I wasn't going to discuss the terms of Uncle Gerald's estate with anyone, including him. I told him I hoped his project found the right investors through the right channels. He said I'd regret treating family like business. I told him I hadn't been the one to make it business. That was the last real conversation we had for a long time. The legal activity on his end went quiet after Conrad's 2nd letter. The journalist never resurfaced. My mother called twice more that month, once to tell me she was upset, once to tell me she was trying to understand. I let her talk both times. Farah came back down in late October and we had dinner at a place she'd read about near the South End. We talked about her practice, a research paper she was writing, a trip she was planning to Portugal. About halfway through the meal, she looked at me and said, "You seem different." I asked how. "Less like you're waiting for something to go wrong." I thought about that. It was accurate. For the first months after the inheritance, I'd spent most of my mental energy on defense, anticipating Holt's next move, documenting, preparing, keeping walls in place. It had been necessary. I didn't regret any of it. But at some point, without quite noticing, the weight had shifted. The walls were still there, but I wasn't standing inside them anymore. I was standing on top of them, looking out. The partnership with Dr. O.C. became official in November. We had a small dinner to mark it, just the two of us and our respective attorneys, which sounds sterile but was actually warm. She'd been building her group for 5 years and she knew exactly what she wanted it to become. I knew exactly what I wanted to put into it. The conversation flowed easily and I drove home that night feeling the particular satisfaction of something that had finally landed in the right place. The Savannah house was still being sorted. Some of Uncle Gerald's things to donate, some to keep, some decisions I hadn't been ready to make yet. I'd started spending one weekend a month there. The neighbor, Mrs. Pace, brought food over the second time I stayed, and we ended up sitting on the porch for 2 hours talking about my uncle, about Savannah, about the magnolia tree and the history of the block. She was in her 70s, and she remembered things about Gerald that I'd never known, that he volunteered quietly at a legal aid clinic for years, that he'd helped 3 different neighbors with their property taxes during a bad stretch in the 90s, that he had terrible taste in television but watched it every night at 8 like a religion. I told her about the unsent letter. Not the contents, just that he'd written one. She nodded like that was exactly the kind of thing he'd do. He could never quite get there in real time, she said. But he always got there eventually. I thought about that a lot afterward. By December, I closed every action item on Conrad's list. The estate was fully settled, the account secured, the legal notices acknowledged. Holt's Charleston project had apparently stalled. I heard this secondhand from a cousin, not from him directly. I didn't feel vindicated by it. I didn't feel much about it at all, which told me something about how far I'd travelled from the person who'd sat in the parking deck the night of Conrad's first call, trying to process a number that didn't feel real. It was real, and it hadn't changed who I was, which was the thing I'd been most afraid of. I drove back to Charlotte on a Sunday evening in mid-December, with the windows cracked and the radio quiet. The highway was nearly empty. I'd left Savannah later than planned because I'd spent an extra hour in Uncle Gerald's study, sitting in his chair looking at the photograph on the desk. I hadn't moved it. There are things you inherit that don't show up in a trust document. The way someone chose to spend their time, what they thought was worth building, the kind of person they believed you were capable of being. Gerald had left me those things too, and they were worth more than he probably knew. The road home was long and clear, and for the first time in months, I wasn't mapping out threats or calculating moves. I was just driving. The miles went by steadily, the same way good work does, unhurried, without announcement, one thing following naturally from the last. That was enough.